Welcome to Could Be Pretty Cool News, the podcast where we dive into the exciting world of creative entrepreneurship. I'm your host, Casey, and together we'll embark on a journey to explore this dynamic ecosystem from multiple angles, including academia, research and data, community building, and compelling personal narratives from creative entrepreneurs themselves. Get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered as we uncover the stories and strategies behind building successful creative ventures. It's time to discover why the world of creative entrepreneurship could be pretty cool. On today's show, we shine a light on the intersection of classical tradition and modern innovation. For our first interview, we're joined by Ricky Schweitzer, the senior curator for Candlelight Concerts, who are redefining the classical music experience for audiences around the globe. In cities from New York to Singapore, Candlelight Concerts are opening their doors, offering a platform for talented musicians to breathe life into both timeless compositions and classical reimaginings of modern hits. And now, let's welcome Ricky to illuminate the unique opportunities that Candlelight Concerts provide for classical artists to be able to connect with audiences in a way that is both opulent and accessible. Okay, great. So, welcome to Could Be Pretty Cool News. We are so excited to have you on the program today. And I was wondering if you could start off by just introducing yourself and what you do.
Sure. So I'm Ricky Schweitzer. I'm the senior curator for Candlelight Concerts with a focus in the Americas, but all of the curators on the team have a global approach. We really are a very tight-knit team. So we have our hands in what goes on as far as Singapore or Vienna or we're now in India. So really anywhere you can think of, we're there, we're going there. So as the curator, it's the easiest way to think about it would be that I'm like that head of the music department. So anything that you hear has to run through us. So anytime anybody on the team has a question about music, whether it's the notes on the page, the licensing of the music, hiring the musicians, anything like that, that goes through us.
Very cool. So I'm wondering, how exactly did Candlelight Concerts actually get started? Like, how was that a conversation within the greater world of everything that Fever does?
Yeah, Candlelight Concert started. Actually, it was our 5-year anniversary of our first concert just a few days ago. It started a little bit before my time. I'm at 3 years now, but the mission was pretty simple. Like from an entrepreneurial standpoint, it's always like fill the need, right? And there was this need to, what we always say is democratize access to classical music. And what we mean by that is that people have sometimes, I think, a musical kind of yearning and hunger for something that's maybe a little bit more esoteric, and it exists in the atmosphere, but they don't know how to reach it. So the majority of our audience has never seen a classical music concert before. I read almost every review we get. We're very fortunate to have very positive reviews, and I can't tell you how many times I'll see things like the orchestra was great. Well, it's a string quartet, not an orchestra, but they don't know the terminology. Or like the violin, like the group of 4 violinists were great. Well, there are 2 violinists, a violist, and a cello. And it doesn't matter. Like the language doesn't matter. What matters is that these people are getting to see something that they never saw before. Maybe they've heard of Beethoven or Mozart. They don't place one of their works, but it's there. It's part of the cultural osmosis. So what we did was we created these shows that were shorter, so they're about an hour long, at a lower price point, and at venues that are just more approachable, with the musicians being closer, for the most part, closer to the audience and interacting with the audience. So it really feels like a more casual sort of event. With that said, there's nothing casual about the way that it looks, at least in our best events. It can be very grand. And so I remember I was just in Orlando traveling to see a show, and one woman, it was very hot. It was Orlando. One woman walked in right after me in a full on gown coming out of a limo. And then a person walked in right after her in shorts and a t-shirt. And I was like, yeah, that's what we want. That's what we want. People to feel like it can be this really great night out, very special. It's a big date night event, but also to be just going to see some fun music.
That's amazing. Democratizing classical music for audiences is such a smart endeavor. And so I'm also curious about how you all are also creating new opportunities, not just for audiences, but for classical musicians themselves. I know a lot of classical musicians, you go to school and there are only a few avenues that people think a classical musician can actually go into as a career. And so I'm curious to know, how does Candlelight Concert help to support freelance classical musicians? You mentioned that you're in charge of hiring the musicians that you select for the concerts. Like, how can classical freelancers actually learn more about this?
Yeah, sure. So, just on a personal note, I can say that it is definitely one of the biggest joys of this job to be able to bring these opportunities to classical musicians. The idea of having a steady gig as a classical musician is basically non existent, right? Like, you can be in an orchestra and you'll play a couple shows a year and they'll be magical and amazing, and maybe you'll get paid really well or whatever it is, but you don't get the opportunity to play every week. And not we don't do that in every city, right? I mean, here in New York, in LA, and in our bigger cities, we have shows constantly. In some of our cities, we have shows once a month. It really depends. But these musicians, they go to school for years. They work so hard to learn their craft, and then they get to sometimes play works that might be kind of stodgy or old or they're not as interested in. And there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, that's what they're trained for. But this is the opportunity to play frequently, to make a living out of it, and to get to interact with audiences more. It's a really fulfilling experience. And so, something I always say is that I'm in the business of hiring musicians and providing substance and a way to support themselves, and not the opposite. So, with our musicians, as long as they are in a place where we do a lot of shows, as long as the reviews are good, their relationship is good, all that, like, it's has the potential for really consistent and fulfilling work. And also, it gives them the opportunity to stretch themselves in ways that other ensembles might not necessarily do. We do our Beethoven shows and that type of thing, but we Vivaldi's one is maybe our global top seller, but we also do Hans Zimmer and Taylor Swift and Beyonce and Adele, and we did Green Day and Blink 182, emo on strings, 90s unplugged. We do so many different kinds of things. In addition to also I say the term jazz shows very loosely. Jazz shows basically mean our non-classical shows, so or like not on string instruments or not on solo piano. So that could be Frank Sinatra or Ella Fitzgerald or Louis Armstrong or anything you can think of. We do tons of those things. So it really is special. And as a musician myself, knowing that it's so hard to find these sorts of opportunities, getting to actually hire people that I went to school with or that I'm friends with that are so talented, and you look at them, I don't want to say struggling because they're not all struggling, but you look at them just being like, what's next? And getting to say, this is what's next. Getting to bring them to the stage, giving them the opportunity to do what they love and really connect with people who've never seen it before is just, it's a magical experience.
So, what is the process for selecting musicians? Is it like an open call for auditions when you need musicians in certain cities? Do you have like a Rolodex of folks who are already in your world where you're like, oh, they would be great for the Green Day show or the Beyonce show?
Yeah, it's very different across the world. So my territories, we have so many cities, it's ridiculous. Hundreds in just the Americas. Globally, many more hundreds. It's gotten crazy how all over the place we are, which in a great way, in a really great way, and it speaks to the abilities of not just the musicians and the musical side of things, the curation team, but the everybody, the project managers, the marketing team, all that. It has become impossible to go to different cities and hold open calls. It's just there's just no way to do it. I would never. I would give up my apartment. I would have no home. And there'd be no way to not be traveling all the time. So what we've done, at least what we the general way we do it globally is we have auditions online. So I a requirement of the job is that you're able to pick up music fast because we do so many shows, so many different shows that if you can't pick up an hour of music, that's honestly pretty tough within a few weeks. It's going to be hard to keep up with this job. That's just the way that it is. So what I'll do is I'll start talking to an ensemble. We have to see some sort of videos, some sort of reason for thinking that this is a group we want to talk to in the first place. And then I'll send out sheet music. Typically, I'll send out one piece of classical music, one piece of film music, and one piece of pop music. I'll send these out. I'll try and make sure that they're hard, but not like our most difficult pieces. I'll say, okay, so I want you within the next week to send me a video of this. Just, I don't expect it to be perfect. I don't want you guys to go completely insane over this. But, as a trained musician, you can pretty much tell the talent level, even if there are mistakes. You can tell how, much pressure they put on the bow and how squeaky they are and how confused they look when they're looking at the music. If they look confused at all, hopefully they don't. So it's pretty easy to tell. And then depending on the cadence of how frequently we do shows, we can then say, all right, you guys sound great. You seem great to work with. We agree on a rate. Um, let's give it a shot. And then I track those reviews very closely. Like I said, we're in hundreds of cities, so that's gotten extremely difficult, but we have so many project managers that are on top of it too. And so anything that is below a 4.7 out of 5, which is a pretty high review, I'm reading it. Anybody's listening to this and they gave less than a 4 and somewhere in the US or Canada, chances are I read your review. We take these things very seriously. And so we love to keep working with the same musicians. And if we have any ability to do that, then we do. But of course, that's not what always happens. And sometimes we do need to find new musicians and then we do more auditions.
Sure. Now, just to clarify, for the reviews that you are paying attention to, are these reviews coming from professional critics? Or are these reviews coming
Hmm.
from audience members? Where are these metrics coming from?
Yeah, so at the end of every show, anybody who bought a ticket through the Fever app will receive an email reminding them, say, hey, let us know what you thought of the show. So while professional critics' reviews are important, very important, they're not really our audience. Our audience is more the person, like I said, who's never seen anything like this before. Our audience for the Beyonce show are Beyonce fans, not classical music fans who have heard Drunken Love. Like it's, and then honestly, actually, I shouldn't say that. It's both. It's people reaching out to different communities, different styles. So it's much more valuable for me to read the reviews of people who are being introduced to this in a new sense than the other way around. And we learn a lot about what people are really looking for. I mean, I remember, not to say too much of a tangent, but I remember seeing one of our shows when I first started with my sister, and the audience, there were people like singing along, and the musicians were like not sure whether to encourage them. And my sister was like, the musicians should really encourage them to sing more, it makes for a more fun environment. And I was like, look, for every one review we get that says, I had such a great time singing along, we get 4 or 5 that says, I didn't pay for a karaoke night. I wanted to hear the musicians. So being able to read so many reviews gives us this perspective of knowing what people are really looking for. And while it is really fun to sing along to these shows, maybe not so loud, or maybe only on the last song or something like that, humming a little bit, but just it's all about being a good neighbor to the other guests who see the show.
Yes, that's so interesting. We love data on the show. And so just hearing about how you incorporate audience feedback and data into how you run your programming, very interesting to us. To go back to one thing about the audition process, I'm surprised to learn that so much of it involves video and online screening. And so if someone or an ensemble or a musician is like, oh, I really want to do this at some point, how important is it for them to already have an established either social media presence, web presence, or is that something that you would say isn't that important to you all?
That's a great question. And it's something that I hope a lot of musicians hear the answer to, because it is sometimes frustrating when we receive a submission and then you go to their website. And the two things that happen all the time that drive me a little bit nuts are, one, no videos, or the videos are from like 12 years ago. And two, they don't say where they're from. I can't tell you how many musician submissions I'm like, okay, cool, but where are you? Are you in Miami or are you in Duluth? Like, maybe we need musicians in one place and not in another, and we get so many submissions that if there's no video and there's no location, we're not reaching out. It's just impossible to do. So yeah. So as far as the social media presence, it's really useful for teams outside of my own to say, hey, these people, like there's a group, Strings from Paris, that I believe we're working with in Toronto, for instance. They have a big social media following. That was we work with the same groups in Toronto most of the time. We work with a lot of agencies, and but we decided to work with them because they had this big social media presence, and our other teams, our data driven teams, like our marketing teams, look at that and they say, cool, no brainer. They're going to bring their own audience to the show, and the show sold out like immediately. So that is very useful. But as somebody who's just gauging musical skill, I don't personally care that much if you have a ton of followers, I care, do you have a recent video? If you show me a video of you playing a Beethoven sonata 12 years ago, I could show you a video of me playing a Beethoven sonata 12 years ago. I can't play a Beethoven sonata anymore. Like, I haven't been classically trained in a long time. So you need recent videos, good quality, and the social media following is useful, but it's not a make or break.
Very cool. I could nerd out about that all day. But how can people find out more about candlelight concerts, the candlelight concerts that are in their cities? What's the best way for them to connect with you all?
So you can go to our website, candlelightexperience.com, and that's the easiest way for sure. But a less direct, but perhaps more fun way of doing it is just to download the Fever app. Our parent company is Fever, so you download the Fever app, and you can actually it'll ask you what city you're in, so you'll go straight to your city or your nearest city. So some of the very small cities that I was mentioning before, we call expansion cities. So we don't have a full Fever marketplace there. So it'll be like, I'm not going to name us, I don't know, I don't think we're in Marietta, but Marietta, as an example, wouldn't have its own market. It would be Atlanta, and then they would see the venue was in Marietta. So you go on there, and then you can just filter by candlelight concerts, and you see everything that's coming up. You can even filter by date and say, like, all right, I want something fun to do this weekend. Is there a candlelight this weekend? I would just say, if anybody's curious, they should just come. It's a really it's a really great experience for built-in fans to the artists that were doing their shows, whether that is Adele or Mozart or Vivaldi, and just try something new. You never know what you're going to fall in love with, honestly.
Joining us next is Lynne Thompson, an esteemed poet and the 4th Poet Laureate of Los Angeles. After a distinguished career in law and academia, Lynne turned to the power of poetry to express her unique voice and vision. Lynne's story is one of inspiration and a testament to following one's passion against all odds. From the influence of her father's hidden poetic talents to her own rise through the ranks of Los Angeles' literary scene, Lynne embodies the spirit of creativity and community.
My name is Lynne Thompson. I'm a native Angelino, the daughter of Caribbean immigrants. I always want to give a shout out to the ancestors. And I served as the 4th Poet Laureate of Los Angeles after practicing law for about 15 years and working at UCLA for another 20 years. My dad was a reader and a closet poet. He was an engineer and a teacher by profession, but he really loved poetry, and he would read it to me and encourage me to read it. And I think my first book that I remember was A Child's Garden of Verses, which back in the day, most kids got that if they were going to get poetry. And I liked the music of it and thought I could do that, and started writing very poorly, of course, as a young person, all through college. And then I went to law school, and that kind of put the kibosh on the poetry, but I never really forgot it. I think a couple of reasons, maybe more than a couple. I was and remain fascinated by how the law works or doesn't work in many cases, as you come to realize over time. I wanted to please the parents who wanted me to do something practical, and the arts were not and remain, except for a small number, a relatively poor way to make a living, or challenging way, I'll say, to make a living. So that wasn't something that my parents pushed, even though my dad was a musician as well, played the violin, but that was kind of on the side. So I went to law school. I had been a legal secretary in a law office, and I thought, well, I can do that. So I went to law school, and I'm so glad that I did. It was a valuable degree. It remains valuable to me today, but I can't say that it was my passion. It was something practical and intellectually stimulating that I did. I'm still curious about it. I still follow cases and that sort of thing, but my heart really was in the creative process of writing a poem. I had been practicing between 14 and 15 years, and literally woke up one day and said, The thing that's wrong with your life, you're not writing poetry. You need to figure out how to do that. And because I was a litigator, which is very demanding, you're either in court, preparing to be in court. For me, it wasn't something that I could balance with anything else. So it occurred to me that I needed to find another job where I could use my skill set. I was not interested in being a poor, unemployed poet. That kind of was not in my mind. And was very lucky in timing that an opening came up at UCLA, for which I was qualified, and a job that I got as the director of their Employee and Labor Relations office. So I was able to use that skill set, and it was a demanding job, but it was demanding in a different way than having been a litigator was. So I found that I could find snatches of time to start writing. I did not want to go back to school. I had just paid off all my law school loans, so I really wasn't interested in going down that road again. I didn't think I wanted to teach, so I looked for other ways to pursue this passion without the traditional academic route. And so I would shape my summers, especially early on when I started doing this, shape my summers so that vacation was at some writing retreat somewhere. And I'm a relatively gregarious person, so I would meet everybody and talk to everybody that I could talk to try to find out, what's the best way into this? Who should I be studying with? Who should I be reading? That sort of thing. And many of these workshops were places where you would actually produce work while you attended. And so I did that for many, many summers. And then in Los Angeles, because I met poets from Los Angeles, they would say, oh, you should call so-and-so, he's leading a workshop or she's leading a workshop, and that would be really beneficial for you. So I cobbled together as best I could a kind of education that didn't involve the academy. And I'm still a little, have mixed feelings about that because I don't have the degree, I don't have an MFA or a PhD, but I thought there's got to be another way. This can't be the only way that you can be a poet. And I've had some people who did go through those programs say, Lynn, in a way, the problem becomes you're studying with Mr. or Mrs. Famous Poet and start to sound like them. And it takes a while before you start to sound like yourself. And I think that by doing it the way I did, which is not the only way, and I'm not saying that that's what people should do, I came to my own voice more quickly than I might have otherwise. And I do use it as an example for people to say there is more than one way to achieve your passion. There's going to be a traditional way, and maybe that's what everybody talks about. But it's not the only way if that's what you really want. You have to be patient, because I had a young student ask me, well, didn't it take longer? And I said, yes, it took longer. But I mean, where am I going? Why I will take the time to do what I need to do. So yes, it took longer. I was working full time. So any time for writing was time I stole from other things because I wanted to do this one thing. And for me, it worked out. For me personally, it was critical, particularly since I didn't have a classroom group of people to go to. It was important for me. And the good thing in a way, and of course everybody won't be in this position, because I was a little older, I wasn't like a scared 20-year-old I was an insecure middle-aged person. But I said, what are they going to do? All they're going to say is, no, you can't come here. But if you don't ask, you don't get. And so I would ask everybody everything I could think of. And as a result of that, people were very supportive in the main. I find writers, for the most part, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but for the most part, people have been so kind to me and said, Lynn, why don't you check this out? Or why don't you read this and call so-and-so? And sometimes I would just call them cold turkey and say, you don't know me, but this is my situation. And the relationships that I was able to establish from the very beginning have been critical to my development as a writer, to my understanding, how does this community work? How do we find each other? So yes, I would say that relationships, and I say it knowing that some people are not as brazen as I was and are more introverted and are shyer. And I say, okay, you may not do it my way, but find another way that you can make those connections, because not everyone is the same type of personality. And I understand that. I believe that we as human beings waste a lot of time. We waste even more time now. So for example, and I was thinking about this today because someone brought it up. If we spend an hour a day on social media, which can go by in a flash and X percentage of the population doesn't, if you took that hour and devoted it to whatever your passion is, you want to be a cook, you want to learn an instrument, whatever it is, if you took that 1 hour and you spent that 1 hour, 7 days, you now have 7 hours of creativity that you've undertaken. And so when I realized I really didn't have a lot of time, I started using my time more efficiently. So if it meant, and I'm a morning person, some people are night people, I'm a morning person. So if I got up 20 minutes earlier or 30 minutes, if I could force myself earlier, that was 30 minutes I could write. If I said, okay, I'm not going to go out with friends at lunch, maybe 3 times a week, I'm going to just close my door and write at my desk. And I say that knowing some people are driving a truck or doing something that means they can't sit down and write. But if you use the available time you have, really think about what is it that I do all day and chart it out, you probably have more time to be creative than you think. I wasn't doing it for the money. When I first told my mom that, I said, I think I'll be a poet now. She said, is there any money in it? And I said, absolutely not. She said, oh my God, what is wrong with you? There aren't many, if any, wealthy poets. Or if they're wealthy, they're not wealthy from the poetry. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So I wasn't really doing it for the money, but I was ambitious enough to want to see my work in print, to make it good enough that it could be in print. And by virtue of that, still not a lot of money, but some money started to come in over time, not early on. I mean, I get invited to read and so forth, and it's fine. And there is some money, but it's not like Stephen King kind of money. When my first book came out, one of my brothers said, now you're going to do this full time? I said, are you nuts? I said, okay, a poet, if they're really well known, may get a run of 20,000 books. I said, Stephen King, by comparison, is 500,000 out the chute. I said, it's just not the same world at all. So poets, I feel fairly confident saying, don't do it for the money, they do it for the love. A lot of poets do teach in the university full time, and even there are those of us like myself, I recently taught in the low residency program at the University of Nevada, Reno. It was a 10-day stint. Fine, you get paid for that, and that's good. So you teach in some way or other. Maybe you give private workshops. I do that as well. Speaking engagements are another way. You get invited to universities and various places. Part of that is if you have a new book, which I have to brag about my new book, Blue on a Blue Palette. Part of the pay is to get the book out into the world so that it gets reviewed, so that it gets purchased more than anything, because that will be income to you as well. But I would say that a large number of poets that I know, and I'm thinking, teach not only at the university, some teach in high school, some teach in elementary school to supplement whatever money they're going to make as poets. If you're the poet laureate of the country, Eddie Limon is the current poet laureate of the country, she's going to be invited to gigs that are really going to give her enough remuneration, arguably, that she can live on that. But there's only one poet laureate at a time of the country or of any municipality. And so the rest of us have to figure out how we can make money from this. So I would say teaching is the primary, not the exclusive way. There are starting to be poets that are working in what we're calling docu-poetry, which is documentary, using poetry with documentaries. I was just contacted last week by a young woman who wants me to do some poems in certain voices for her documentary. So there's certainly some other types of gigs out there, but I would say that teaching and speaking engagements are the prime, and the book itself, if the book sells well, and let's say it wins a prize. I have friends who won the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize. If the book gets that kind of attention, then yes, you're probably going to have a lot of invitations, not just traditional speaking gigs, but a lot of invitations that will pay you for that. But again, if you compare it to a novelist, it's just not the same thing at all. There had been 3 poet laureates in Los Angeles before myself in recent time. And you put in an application. There is a committee from the Department of Cultural Affairs that looks at all the applications. They pick someone, they tell you. Well, as luck would have it, I put in my application in February of 2020 to be the poet laureate to be announced in April of 2020. And in between those 2 events, a little pandemic broke out. So we didn't hear anything about it. Nobody's working, or they're working from home. And I frankly forgot about it. The following January, and in fact, it was the night before President Biden was inaugurated, I'm on the phone and I'm doing double duty, which you shouldn't do. I'm on the phone and I'm looking at my emails. And there's an email that says, "Congratulations on being the poet laureate." I said, I'm telling my friend on the phone, this is one of those emails that you get that says, "I'm lost in Paris. Could you please send me $10,000? So I read the email and she said, "Well, I don't know. It sounds legitimate to me." I said, "They don't write, they don't call, they don't ask me if I died of COVID." Fine. So I called the city the next day and they said, "Oh yeah, we've chosen you." So that was the actual process and how I was notified. I do want to say that I get asked, particularly like by high school and college students, how can I go about being the poet laureate? And I tell them the same thing. You can't really go about being the poet laureate. I mean, at some point you can apply, sure. But the fact is, I think that being a good poetry citizen, which means not only working on your own work, but supporting the work of your fellow poets, being in community with them, whatever that means, encouraging them to submit their manuscript or helping them edit their manuscript or whatever. I think those things go a long way towards being selected, because usually, I can't speak for every location, but usually they're looking for a community builder and someone who is willing to reach out to the entire community, not just to those poets that are good friends or write like they do, but to all poets in the community, as well as promoting poetry for everyone. So I just think that's an important thing, particularly for people who are beginning that path, to know that if you really want to be part of the community, it's not only about you, it's about the others around you who are doing the same thing.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Until next time, we encourage you to continue nurturing your process. Farewell, and may all of your creative endeavors flourish. Could Be Pretty Cool News is a Could Be Pretty Cool original production that was workshopped as a part of the 2023 Google News Initiative Pre-Launch Lab. This episode was edited by Trinity Jackson. Our executive producer and host is Casey Willis, and our production coordinator is Liz Moore. The original theme music was composed by Camille Stennis, and our cover art was designed by Aaliyah Johnson. Special thanks to our guests,